If you have your own creepy story, I'm waiting for your email. All the information under the video. Thank you for watching. Please, press like and subscribe to my channel. I continue to visit him where he's kept, from time to time. And I can say he even appears to have found some sort of peace. But he will never be released. At the end of each visit, he always grips my hands and tells me to watch out for that giant moose. He does that every time, even though so many years have passed since that summer when we first saw the giant moose. My family, Mom, Dad, and Robbie and I, had first seen the injured giant moose a few weeks before Dad's breakdown, during a visit to a local wildlife park in our region. We had wandered round the grassy enclosures, looking at the animals, nothing especially exotic. I remember beavers and otters and deer and a couple of wolves, lying back from the wired fences and watching us indolently through their sharp yellow eyes. Birds, too, eagles and hawks and others with bright feathers, flitting around their large dome-shaped cages. Peacocks wandered freely on the narrow open trails, and Robbie toddled about, feeding them, or trying to. The wounded giant moose was not in an open enclosure. It was housed in a small shed, and a notice by the door alerted visitors that the moose was injured and receiving veterinary treatment. There was a sharp, horrible smell hanging around the hut, and flies buzzed around us. We had all peered in on the moose through the small window. There the smell was sharper, and at first it looked completely dark inside the shed. Dad had picked me up and held me close to the window so I could get a better look. Despite the dark, I could see the wound in his neck quite clearly. The gaping sides of the wound quivered, in time with the moose's heavy, labored breathing. We wondered how the injury happened. The moose turned his head and looked directly into my eyes. The smell and the sight of blood made me feel queasy, and I looked back at Dad and asked him to put me back down. He had laughed, told me not to be such a wuss, held me up higher and gripped me tighter. I had started screaming and squirming, begging him to put me down. Mom had murmured, "Oh, put her down, will you?" and then started wandering away, pushing Robbie, who was still in a pushchair in those days. Finally, Dad put me down, and we followed Mom and Robbie, Dad still laughing at my silliness over the moose. We all got into the car to leave. Before the car moved, the giant moose with the wounded neck suddenly appeared, seemingly out of nowhere by the car, and brought its massive head down and peered in at us through the car window. It happened so quickly that I was startled and gave a small scream. Dad swore loudly and swerved off. Mom didn't tell him off as she usually would for swearing. When we got home, the moose was already in the garden, peering in through our windows, the blood from its injury gleaming red in the late afternoon sun. "What the actual fuck?" yelled Dad. "I'm going to call the police." "Wait a minute," said Mom, who had already pulled out her mobile. "Everybody stay in the car." Mom called the park and asked about the moose, carefully avoiding saying it was in our garden. I remember that clearly. The park person told her the moose had died earlier that day, just about the time we would have been leaving the park. So Dad didn't call the police, and the moose just stood there in our garden, looking in on us through our windows. Nobody else could see him, just us. None of the neighbors, no one. We realized that from the beginning. None of us even bothered asking. He was always there, just for us. He was silent, only moving his wounded, bloody neck to lower or raise his giant antlered head, sometimes looking through the ground floor windows, sometimes craning his neck high to look through the windows on the first floor. It didn't matter if we drew the curtains. He'd still be there, trying to peer through. He didn't hurt us, but was always there watching us. When we left the house to go out, he would turn to watch us leave, and then stand there silently on our return, watching us enter. Only Robbie didn't really mind him, although I knew he could see him. It must have been only a few weeks later. Summer was over, but the weather was still warm. We had not really gotten used to the moose, but it was clear Dad didn't like it when we talked about him, so we didn't. I glanced outside my bedroom window. The giant moose was there as always in the garden, bent down, looking into the living room window. Mom and Robbie must have been there. That must be why he was looking in on them. If the living room had been empty, I knew he would be at my window, his neck craned high and staring right in at me. I would see the gaping open wound on his neck close up, the details of blood and sinewy muscle fresh and clear in the early afternoon sun. Even from the distance of the bedroom window, I could still see the wound. I tried to concentrate on my homework. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, followed by the sound of shattering glass and Mom's scream. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I ran to the window. I couldn't help it. Dad was firing at the giant moose, who stood there immobile as always, and continued looking in through the window, undisturbed. Mom was screaming my name. My window shattered, and I felt the warm spray of blood on my face. I ran under the bed, and the gunshots continued. The pain started. Eventually, after a very long time, the police came and took Dad away. Mom had only been slightly injured from the shattered glass, and I was soon fine too. It was clear Dad hadn't been aiming at us. Mom and Robbie and I moved to a new high-rise apartment building close to the city center, with no garden. We never saw the moose again. The small town of Ashwood had always been a peaceful and quiet place, located far from the big cities. It seemed like an ideal escape from the hustle and bustle of the modern world. But in recent weeks, something had changed. Nightly attacks had frightened the townspeople, and no one knew who or what was behind them. Mark, the local school teacher, was one of those who began to suspect that something was wrong. He often woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, not remembering how he had gone to bed. He noticed strange scratches on his hands that hadn't been there the night before. These oddities began to instill a fear in him that he might somehow be involved in these nighttime horrors. Each evening, he tried to stay awake, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was happening. One night, armed with a flashlight and a knife, he decided not to go to bed. The town was dark and quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Mark sat in his kitchen, struggling to keep his eyes open. The clock struck midnight, and suddenly he heard a strange sound. It was like a whisper coming from the woods behind his house. Mark stood up, trembling with fear but resolute, and headed toward the door. The whisper grew louder, emanating from deep within the forest. Mark stepped into the woods, his heart pounding. The flashlight illuminated a narrow path ahead of him. Suddenly, the beam of light caught something ahead. It was a figure, hidden in the shadows. Mark froze in place. The figure stepped forward and he recognized himself. "Who are you?" Mark shouted, his voice shaking. The figure remained silent, but the whispering grew around him. Suddenly, the figure began to change, transforming into something terrifying and unreal. Mark felt his consciousness start to fade. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. Everything went black. When he woke up, he was back in his bed as if nothing had happened, but his hands were covered in blood, and words were scrawled on the bedroom wall. "This is just the beginning." Mark realized that he could no longer escape the horror that had taken root in his soul. Each night, he would battle his inner demon, trying to unravel the mystery of what was happening. But one thing was clear. The nightmares in the town of Ashwood were only just beginning. The next day, Mark decided to speak to a few townspeople. He wanted to find out if anyone else had experienced similar occurrences. His first visit was to the town's elder, Mr. Johnson. The old man was wise and knew much about the local legends. "Mark, what brings you here so early?" Mr. Johnson asked as Mark entered his home. "Mr. Johnson, I need to talk to you. I think something dark is happening in our town, and I might be involved," Mark began, trying not to reveal his fear. Mr. Johnson looked at him thoughtfully and slowly nodded. "I have long suspected that something unnatural is occurring in this town," he replied. "There is an old legend about a spirit that possesses people and forces them to do terrible things. But this spirit can be expelled." "How?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "You need to find the spirit's source of power and destroy it. But finding it won't be easy. It could be anything. An object, a place, or even a person." Mark felt that this information could be the key to his liberation. He decided that he would investigate every detail of his life and surroundings to find the source of this horror. That night, he again stayed awake. He carefully examined his house, trying to find anything unusual. Suddenly, he noticed an old doll lying in the corner of his bedroom. The doll had belonged to his grandmother, and he had never paid it any mind. But now it seemed strange and sinister. He carefully picked up the doll and felt a cold emanating from it. Suddenly, he felt as if the doll's eyes were following him. Mark dropped it to the floor and stepped back. "It's you. You're the source," he shouted, gripped by terror. He grabbed the doll and ran out of the house, heading into the woods. He knew he had to destroy it to free himself from the curse. When he reached the heart of the forest, he built a fire and threw the doll into the flames. Suddenly, he heard screams and moans coming from the fire. It was unbearable, but he stood there, watching, as the doll turned to ashes. When the flames died down, Mark felt a weight lift off his shoulders. But he also knew that this was not the end. He realized that the evil in this town could take many forms, and now his task was to protect his town from such threats. Several days passed, and the town grew quieter. Mark continued to keep watch for any strange occurrences, determined to protect his neighbors. He became the guardian, ready to fight the darkness for the peace of his town. I was hurtling down the sinuous path, fleeing from my brother as it wound deeper into the forest. I could not look back, not after what had happened. Ahead, the trail opened up and led me to the maw of a grotesque cave. The cave's abyss extended so deeply that it felt infinite, and the absence of any visible life or flora made it appear utterly lifeless. Panting heavily, I heard my brother's voice now near from a distant calling for me, filled with grief and anger. Without a second thought, I plunged into the cave, hoping to find refuge in its darkness. The cave's depths were terrifying. It had a stark, repulsive stench, reminiscent of rotting meat, and the sound of mournful cries echoed from deep within the cave, distant yet haunting. I continued running until the light from the entrance became a distant memory. I collapsed onto my knees, drenched in sweat, trembling with fear, and tears streaming down my face, as if my life were about to end. I mustered the strength to stand, feeling completely lost and barely able to see my hands in front of my face. Driven by fear, I began to walk slowly, waving my hands to guide myself. The heat was searing and grew more intense with each step. In the distance, a sudden faint glow drew my eye. A tall figure twice my height, wearing a black cape and rare glowing stone ornaments, with skin so pale it seemed almost lifeless, as if no blood flowed in his veins, was moving towards me. His eyes were as black as the cave itself, not even glimmering with the light of the fire. Fear overwhelmed me, and I turned to run for my life, but his menacing voice followed closely behind. "Don't run. Once entered, no one has ever escaped. There are no exits. This cave is infinite." Despair clawed at me as I ran. I stumbled and fell, my vision blurring as I hit the floor. How could I believe there was no escape from this? Darkness overtook me, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was no longer in the cave, but resting on my brother's back, his steady footsteps carrying us towards a van parked just ahead. "Where am I?" I mumbled, still dazed. "You got tired and fell asleep while we were out," my brother explained. "So, I carried you back." As we drove away, I struggled to make sense of the nightmare, the cave, the threatening figure, the endless darkness. It all felt too real to ignore. Surrounded by the familiar forest, my fear began to wane, but an unsettling feeling still remained. We drove home in silence. As we arrived, a rush of fear and confusion hit me. Our front door was wide open, and police cars lined the street. Something was seriously wrong. Inside, an officer approached us, his face ashen and his voice heavy with concern. "Are you the homeowner's sons?" he asked, pausing as he searched us for any sign of understanding or disbelief. My brother nodded, his face blank with shock. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your parents were found dead. They were stabbed multiple times with a knife. A wave of terror suddenly froze me in place. I remembered the horrifying scene, blood smeared across the floor and on my clothes, the vacant, lifeless eyes of my parents, the gruesome slashes on their bodies with their mutilated limbs spread all over the place. The rest was a horrific blur, leaving me numb and disoriented. How could this happen? Who could have done something like this? Why would anyone commit such a monstrous act? Such questions ran through my soul. An officer pulled my brother aside, his voice cold and authoritative. "We need to ask you some questions. You're the prime suspect. We have found evidence." My mind whirled. The police believed my brother was the killer. The weight of their accusation was devastating. My memories were fragmented and unclear. Why couldn't I remember what happened? The fear and confusion were intense. My heart thudded, each unanswered question worsening the fear and making the truth seem even more out of reach. Days passed in a blur, blending together with no clear sense of time. My brother was taken away, charged with the murders. I felt lost, unable to grasp the reality of the situation. Was this all real? If yes, why was my brother chasing me? I was left in complete disarray. On the day of his trial, I visited him one last time. He looked at me with intense eyes, his face tired and worn. His gaze was filled with a mix of fear and desperation, and the silence between us felt charged with unspoken words. I thought I do ask him what had happened, but suddenly, he cut through the silence with fierce intensity. "Wake up. I warned you. The cave has no exits. There's no escaping it. This place is endless." In a heartbeat, I was back in the cave, the suffocating darkness closing in around me. My heart hammered in my chest, each breath coming in shallow, quick gasps as terror gripped me. The oppressive blackness pressed in, making every moment feel like a battle against the consuming fear. Then, in the darkness, my eyes were horrified and helplessly drawn towards my hand, slick with cold, dried blood, gripping the knife. Don't forget subscribe and press like. Thank you for watching.